And you could blame their pollsters, you could blame the media, and to be fair, yes, they were very friendly to the Reagan administration, but at the end of the day, they're the only ones who can make that decision. And their assumption, was made like in 1985, right before the Iran-Contra scandal, and they still decided to move in that direction. And so they take that and they ignore how Democrats won primaries. And they essentially ignored Carter's victory in that framework. In fact, I think when the Clintons were working for Carter, she said that she was strangled by one of his people in Indiana. Okay, found it. I'm very lucky that nothing bad happened to me. One time in college, I went on a blind date, and a young man wouldn't take the repeated no's for an answer, so I had to slap him to get him away from me. But he did back off. I went to bed that night shaken, but not traumatized. And when I was 29, working for Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign in Indiana, I had dinner one night with a group of older men who were in charge of the Democratic Party's get out and vote operation in the state. I'd been pestering them a while for information about the election day plans, and they were annoyed with me. I started explaining once again what I needed to know from them and why. Suddenly one of the men reached across the table, grabbed me by my turtleneck, and yanked me down towards him. He hissed in my face, "Just shut up." I froze. Then managed to pull his hand from my neck and tell him to never touch me again, and walk out of the room on shaking legs. The whole incident probably lasted 30 seconds. I'll never forget it. Now, okay, couple things here. Either she didn't, I couldn't find much on this story. So either she didn't make a big thing out of this and was essentially covering from the Indiana DNC. Two, she made it up back then and used it for leverage. Why do I think that? It's because she was a White House intern for his opponent. She was an intern for Gerald Ford. And that's who he was running against. He lost Indiana, by the way. Now, that could be the case. And then another scenario is that she could have made it up later. And why would I say that? It's because, she started thinking about this story in relation to the yes, all women thing. This was around the time, that, she was running in the election, and she was essentially trying to get endorsements from every former president she could. And Carter, I don't think ever much liked the Clintons, but he gives her this glowing endorsement about how he remembers her in the campaign, her in his losing campaign in Indiana, and he decided one day I'm going to vote for her to be president. So, even when she's working for Carter, she's basically undermining him, and then she goes on to ignore his victory. And that's not even really getting into the worst of it. But back to Iran-Contra and where she really came from. Well, where she really came from was negotiating these contracts for these kind of middlemen for the CIA, and this included guys who were funneling arms to Iraq to use against Iran, and then they switch around and they run drugs and weapons, and they there's and that her husband essentially has a carte blanche to cover it up. There's a lot on this. So, for example, his Arkansas Development Front was, the linchpin of a lot of this operation. In fact, the Arkansas State Police was, it was blocked every time. Uh, the entire infrastructure within Arkansas. There's no way he couldn't have known about some aspect of this. But even more, but there's these sort of salacious books about this topic. But let's just say that it's a few miles away. And during the 70s, Hillary Clinton was actually making money off these, what would be called, I believe they're like proto hedge funds. They're proto hedge funds. But another aspect of this was speculating in commodities, and she actually made money as a speculator in 1978. And these derivative contracts linked her to these Texas oil men and these kind of Arabic guys who made money off the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan because they knew the gold prices were rising. And she was tied in with the sons of the billionaire H.L. Hunt. And in a short period, they amassed 200 million ounces of silver. 200 million ounces. That's like, I can't even imagine that much silver. But when the silver prices fell, they actually kind of got screwed, but they lost millions of dollars illicitly selling the silver. And through this kind of trading, through the proto hedge funds, through commodities, they got their connections with Goldman Sachs, with the Salomon brothers. Of course, he would make it into their Secretary of State. The Lehman brothers, of course. Now, you might be thinking this isn't a this isn't a very out there sort of, but no, this isn't something I got from my Clinton voter's dad's library called Devil Take the Hindmost. And much of this can also be found in court documents. Now, so for both financial reasons and political reasons, that's why they link back to Irangate, Iran-Contra. Now, one of their funders, Lynn Forrest de Rothschild, got involved in in Democrat politics in the late 70s, which is when they got involved in politics, working for Senator Dan Patrick Moynihan. But also she was working with Republicans like Elliott Abrams, who was heavily involved in Iran-Contra affair and messing around in Latin America, which was basically their first playground in it was the first thing they were given around to mess around with back when George Bush Sr. was calling them the crazies in the basement back in the 90s. I know I'm jumping around a bit, but understanding things requires a degree of jumping around. So they supported the Contras covertly, but they also supported the Contras openly. In the 80s, he actually sent the Arkansas State Guard to give them support, or to give these kind of right-wing militia groups that the U.S. relied on Latin America support. He took the Arkansas State Guard and he sent them to Honduras to train the Contras to overthrow the Sandinista government. This is according to Mint Press. But this was covered in UPI. back in 1986. I think UPI, if I remember correctly, that actually is connected to NPR. So this is a public radio that's saying this, or well, not public radio, but something that is tied that could be tied to public communications. And not only that, but his coalition, the Democratic Leadership Council, which was these kind of new centrist Democrats started by, these sort of ghoulish guys like Morris, like Dick Morris, who constantly pushes to shift the Democratic Party rightward. That basically went to the right of Henry Scoop Jackson on on things that weren't foreign policy. So it basically meant less money for the welfare that they initially said they wanted, and more money for military ventures. So from the beginning, you have them supporting Reagan's foreign policy. I think a Counterpunch article put it best when they described Clintonism as Reaganite malware. I thought, perfect. That all everything I'm reading about the left scrapes with the Clintons is perfectly described by that sentence. But the problem is that they become more right wing in a period which these lines are blurred, and right wing increasingly means neoconservative, means like Cold War Republican, and they even, Nixon. All right, I'll say the controversial thing that he wasn't perfect, but he, he was the pre-neocon Republican. So when they're supporting the Contras on kind of the right flank of the Democratic Party, is there anyone actually supporting, perhaps against this, perhaps pressuring them? Well, yeah, some elements of what's left of the New Left actually supported the other side, the Sandinistas. In fact, one politician from Vermont would actually bring the issues of the Contras versus the Sandinistas and get some press coverage. This guy was a Bernard Sanders, who we'll talk about later.